Welcome to the second of our series of lessons on In the Beginning, looking at the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. In this lesson, we're going to concentrate on chapter 1, which examines the beginning of everything. But before we begin looking at the text, let's have a quick outline of what we are about to cover. This outline of the chapter, I think, works. It's based on looking at each day and what would happen on that day. So day 1, we've got the creation of light. Day 2, creation of the expanse. Day 3, creation of dry ground and vegetation. Day 4, creation of the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, creation of sea life and birds. Day 6, animal and human life is created. And finally, on day 7, God ceased creating. Now keep in mind, this chapter was not written to give us scientific information, but what we do find here is accurate scientifically. The opening verse of Genesis starts at the point time began. In the beginning. Well, what was there before this? Well, there was really a time when there was no time, and that's difficult, if not impossible, for us to comprehend. The biblical view of time would look something like this. In the beginning, there was eternity, and then time, and then eternity again. In eternity, we discover Jesus, the Father, the Spirit, existed before time began. John 17:5 indicates that. And there are other passages which refer to things that happened and promises that were made before the beginning. Ephesians 1:3 and 4, before the foundation of the world, God chose a group of people that would be holy and blameless. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18, God decided before the beginning that we would be redeemed with the precious blood of Christ. Titus 1, the first 3 verses, God had determined before the beginning that eternal life would be for those who follow God. And 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, God had decided before the beginning that his grace would be given in Christ Jesus. See, one thing we see from all of this is that love and thought and communication existed before the creation of the heavens and the earth. So that was eternity past. Then we have time. And within time, we have all that was made. It's where we are now. But once that's taken away, we're going to be left once again with eternity and 2 possibilities where we will spend eternity. I find it interesting that the Bible has very much a linear view of time. There's a definite beginning. There will be a definite end to time. Most other non-Christian religious systems see time as cyclical. Not all of them, but a good part of them. In other words, see it as a circle. No beginning, no ending, but a constant reforming. We call that reincarnation, do we not? The opening of Genesis, though, firmly roots this narrative, which opens up the entire Bible, in space and time. In other words, this is real history, just like what is happening today is real history as well. Notice that the Bible does not attempt to tell about the origin of God. Just in the beginning, he's there. There's no defense of God. There's no explanation of God. God is there, and God is creating. That word translated create means to bring into being, to cause to exist. Well, how did the earth come about then? Well, the Bible tells us that God created it, and God created it out of nothing. We often refer to that as creation ex nihilo. And the Hebrew writer sort of refers to that as well in Hebrews 11 and verse 3. Bill Grasham, in his commentary on Genesis in the Truth for Today series, said, even though this verse does not specifically state that God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing, it implies such, since he did so effortlessly by simply speaking the word. The Hebrew word for created in verse 1 is from the word bara, B-A-R-A, in English letters, which indicates to create. And although it cannot be used exclusively to mean out of nothing, it can mean out of nothing. In fact, some suggest this word is only used in connection with God, and I know of no instances to contradict it. Both Wenham in the Word Bible commentary and Grasham in the Truth for Today commentary both confirm that it's always used in existence with God. Now, it's sometimes interchanged with another word, asa, A-S-A-H in English letters, which means to make. The first part of the creation was the heavens and the earth. In other words, the earth, the universe, the cosmos, it may be used to simply denote the totality of the creative act of God. Gordon Wenham, in the Word Biblical Commentary, says Genesis 1:1 therefore could be translated, in the beginning, God created everything. This opening paragraph can be taken to be either a summary of the entire creation, and that's a very common method of writing in the Old Testament, to summarize it and then expand on it, or it could be a statement of the beginning process as well. Peter Williams, in the Day 1 commentary from Eden to Egypt, said, what a haunting phrase this is with which the Bible opens. In the beginning, God. It says it all. For if we accept in faith the truth of this statement, then we shall have no difficulty whatever of believing the rest of the Bible's message. On the other hand, if we reject the truth of this opening statement, then we shall not only find it impossible to believe much of what the Bible teaches, but we put our souls in grave peril. When the earth was initially created, it was not as we find it today. Text tells us it was without form and void. It was dark. It was in a state of disorder. Bill Grasham again writes, the joining of the two terms of these prophetic doom oracles builds an interpretation that sheds light on the meaning of Genesis 1:2-31, namely that nothing can be pronounced good until darkness, chaos, and emptiness are replaced by the creation of light, form, beauty, and meaning. There's definitely something lacking after the heavens and the earth were made. Darkness, the text tells us, was on the face of the deep. There had been no light yet created, so all was in darkness. Now, it's hard to get a picture of something that's totally dark, so there's a bit of darkness here and a bit of light, but you get the picture. Deep, by the way, is probably a good description. What we can tell is that this ball of water was really, really deep. So picture in your mind, in space, basically a huge ball of water. The Spirit of God was hovering or moving over the face of the waters. The word translated spirit in the Hebrew is the word ruach, and can mean either wind or spirit. But it's when it's combined with Elohim, which we have here, it is not indicating a wind, but it's talking about God's Spirit. When ruach does mean wind, it does suggest a destructive force. The context of Genesis 1 tells us that this is not the meaning here because it isn't destructive, but creative. The Ruach Elohim here is part of a constructive, creative process. Again, Bill Grasham, the verse emphasizes that in spite of this seemingly unorganized situation in the watery deep, the protective Spirit of God kept it all in control. It was only a matter of time until God began to speak and bring forth order, life, and beauty from the first stage of his creation. By the way, we see all three of the Godhead involved in the creation in these opening verses. God the Father was the source and origin of the creation. In the beginning, God created. The Spirit of God is there hovering over the waters, an indication that the Spirit is involved in some way. And then the Word of God we find as God speaks these things into existence. The opening of John's Gospel is very similar to the opening of Genesis, only he writes it this way: in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were created by him, and without him nothing was created. By the way, we see all three of these again acting together when man is made in verse 26. God then spoke light into existence. Let there be light. And light was created. And there's a separation of the light and the darkness. Notice that darkness was not removed completely, but separated from the light to keep them distinct. Each would have its sphere in a point of time, one followed by the other. And we see this consistently throughout this chapter. God speaks and something happens. We call this fiat creation, creation by decree. The psalmist in Psalm 33 talks about this. Notice that light is created before the sun. The sun's not going to be created until day 4. Some have suggested that's unscientific. It's not really, because even science postulates the primary character of light being present before the sun. But that really shouldn't be a problem for us. If God can create a universe out of nothing, making light would not be a problem. Bill Gresham writes, the fact that God created light 3 days before he created the sun need not trouble the reader, because all that the writer of Genesis affirmed is that God caused the light to shine from a different source than the sun on that first day. And besides, when you think about it, is light not part of the character of God? John writes in 1 John chapter 1, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. God is light. So what's the problem with him putting light into his creation? The light's given a name, by the way, day, and darkness is called night. Same terminology that we use today. Bill Gresham wrote, in the Old Testament, to give a name to something was to assert dominion over it. And he gives some references where that's the case. In this way, God defined the proper roles that these named creations should play in his plan. Of course, you might ask, why evening before morning? There is evening and morning, day 1. Why evening before morning? I would suggest it's because there was darkness first and then light was created. And as the dark is night and the light is day, it makes this sense to say, and there is evening before saying, and there was morning. By the way, that's the Jewish concept of a day. The day begins at 6 p.m. Their day goes from 6 p.m. to the next 6 p.m. And that's one day in the Jewish way of reckoning time. Now, and ours is based on the Roman system. We count time from midnight to midnight. I guess it doesn't matter too much which point we choose, but there is a day that takes place. Creation, then we see in these first 5 verses, is described as a move from disorder to order, as God takes that which is without form and void and orders them into a working world, which then begins to move from order back to disorder once it was created. But initially, he creates light, and he saw that the light was good. Bill Gresham commented, when God pronounced his creation good, and concluded by stating that it was very good. He was not using the Hebrew word tab in the sense of something that is morally or ethically good, in contrast to that which is bad or evil. To the contrary, the idea expressed is that the Lord fully approved and accepted what he had made because it was just as it ought to be, without any blemishes or flaws that needed to be corrected. It was good when light was added to the creation. The next day, God made an expanse to separate the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. That's in verses 6 and 7. Expanse is a word that's not part of our normal everyday vocabulary. Other translations have other words which may or may not help to convey the idea here. Some use he created the heaven, the sky, the vault, the firmament, a canopy. The Hebrew word is the word rachia, and it's properly rendered expanse. Literally, it means in English, spread out. I think maybe our translators use other words because they really don't understand this concept. But what is this expanse? We know that God called the expanse heaven in verse 8. Some translations suggest in the footnote that this may be the sky, or some even put it in the text, such as the NIV. I believe this expanse is referring to interstellar space. I was first introduced to this idea by physicist Dr. Russell Humphreys. He gave some verses in the Bible which have pretty well sold me on this idea. Bill Grasham suggests that it is looking at everything above the earth in the way that humans perceive everything above us, as in the skies. And when we look above us, we see everything from the birds, the clouds, and the stars, and the moon, and the other planets. And he suggests it's just referring to our way of looking at things. But that's what God does on day 2. There is evening and there is morning. The second day. The first thing God did on the third day was to gather the waters together into one place to let dry land appear. The dry land was called earth, and the waters were called seas. Now notice that the seas were not gathered together into several different locations, but into one location. Thus, there would have been one landmass. We need to keep in mind that this sea and land were not the same as we have today. There was a global flood, which we'll get to in Genesis chapter 6 in a few lessons. But that global flood completely changed the earth's surface. We find in verse 10 God's appraisal of what he's done so far. And God saw that it was good. But they did not end there. Vegetation and plant life were also created on this day. There are 3 types of plant life listed here. There's grass and vegetation. Seem to refer to all spreading, ground-covering vegetation that is on the earth. It refers to plants. We might call those bushes and shrubs. And then there are trees, all large woody plants, including the fruit-bearing trees. Notice God did not create seeds. He created full-grown plants, able to produce seeds from the time they were created. There is one phrase that we should mention. These are seed-bearing plants and seed-bearing fruit trees after their kind. What does that tell us? That tells us that apple trees produce seeds, which, when planted, produce apple trees. The plants are created mature with the ability to reproduce. And the seeds are going to create the same type of plant that you started with. That phrase, after their kind, is used 10 times in this chapter. So it must be of great importance that when something reproduces, it reproduces the same thing. Edwin Jones, in his commentary on Genesis, said, as life here first comes into being, one of the most powerful phrases in Genesis is given by the Creator, after their kind. These three words confound the basic assumption of evolution. Every scientific experiment ever performed by man only confirms these words from Genesis. So God again saw that it was good. Notice the logicalness thus far of the creation. It was necessary for the creation to be in this order because for plants to survive, they need light, air, and soil, which were provided on days 1 and 2 and earlier on day 3. For what was going to happen later on day 6, there is a need not only of dry ground, but of vegetation as well. The third day ended, and twice on that day, God saw that it was good. In the fourth day, we find the creation of lights in the expanse of the heavens in verse 14. There's more detail of what happened this day than anything else in this chapter except for the creation of humans. Notice that these are simply referred to as lights. A greater light to control the day, that's the sun, of course, and a lesser light to rule the night, the moon. And of course, the stars as well. Of course, we realize today scientifically that the sun is a star. But what we're looking at here is simply as we view things, as it's viewed from the earth. So we have the greater light in the daytime, a lesser light at night, and of course, the stars at night as well. And we realize that some of what we call stars that we see in the sky are really planets around us. These lights had three purposes. The sun and moon were going to take over the function of separating light from darkness. It would seem that the light had earlier been illuminating the earth was from the same direction of the same intensity that the sun now provided. And again, this would not be a problem for God, because if he made one, he could make the other. But they had another purpose. The text tells us, let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Not just day and night, which have been in motion since day one, but we also now have seasons and years. There's a way to measure time in a lot longer time period. And they were, of course, to provide light on the earth. So what we really find here on day 4 is light given homes, if you will. And of course, an expansion of timekeeping. More than just a day. The moon, by the way, also provided a basis for months, because most early calendars, including the Jewish calendar, were what we call lunar calendars, based on the phases of the moon. The sun would provide a basis for years, as well as seasons. The stars seem to be some of the signs referred to as well, possibly in identifying the seasons, depending on what is visible at a particular time. The moon, by the way, could also be included in that phrase signs, because it controlled tides as well. But this ended day 4, and God saw that it was good. On the 5th day, God created from the waters swarms of living creatures, and he said, let the birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. Henry Morris writes, the first introduction of animal life was not a fragile blob of protoplasm that happened to come together in response to electrical discharges over a primeval ocean, as evolutionists believe. Rather, the water suddenly swarmed abundantly with swarming creatures. And that's a better way of looking at what's happened here on day 5. This is the first time that we find the Hebrew word nephesh, translated living creatures. This is also the word used in Hebrew for soul, although its most basic meaning is that of life. Notice that the plants did not have nephesh. Only animals and humans do. This tells us that the life of animals is different from the life of plants. Now, we know that from observation and through common sense. But keep in mind, evolutionary theory holds that all types of life are related, both plant and animal, through being descended from a common ancestor. Verse 21 elaborates some on what was created, and he created great sea monsters, and all the creeping, moving creatures, every living creature really that moves in the waters. And the water abounded with them as well. The water was just full of them. Now, that would not just be limited to fish, but would include all sea creatures, fish, whales. Now, we classify those as mammals. But remember, our whales are classified as mammals, but remember that our modern classification system is man-made, not God-given. It would include some reptiles. You see one, I think, just in the background of this photo. That could be a fish as well, I'm not sure. But some reptiles, such as the sea turtles. Also included would be the many extinct sea creatures, which we sometimes refer to as dinosaurs, although they strictly aren't. But they would make great candidates for the sea monsters, would they not? In addition to the swarming creatures, God also made every winged bird after its kind. This would have included, besides birds, anything that flew. Hebrew word for bird here is literally flying things. And that would include bats, probably insects, and the flying prehistoric reptiles, such as the pteranodon. Notice that this is in contrast, again, to the current evolutionary theory, which suggests that dinosaurs were here first, land creature, and they evolved into birds, after the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, of course. Often we think of the creation just in terms of the creatures on the earth at the time when we live, forgetting that many of these would not have been present at creation because they are the product of crossbreeding, and we know when they came into being. Plus the many, many creatures, of course, that are now extinct would have been there at the beginning. So, again, I think we can see the logic of the creation. Plant life, which presumably covered the sea plant life, the algae as well, was created before the animals began to exist. This was necessary so that the birds and the aquatic life would have food to eat. And once again, God saw that it was good. We also find for the first time God blessing the creation, giving what he had just created the instruction to be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the seas and let birds multiply on the earth. Again, we see that these creatures were made fully mature, able to reproduce. A similar instruction was given to the animals when they emerged from the ark. And that concluded day 5. Bill Grasham comments, at this point, a description of the final day of creation is presented, and more details given to it than to the previous 5, because the mighty acts of God reached their climax in the creation of land animals and human life. On this day, God made the creatures which would live on the land, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. This would include many of the animals that we know, although some of our modern domesticated animals, as we mentioned, especially the livestock, we know to be the result of breeding and therefore would not have been there, but their ancestors would have. There would have been also the various extinct beasts, which we only know through fossils, or sometimes like the dodo through a stuffed animal. plus possibly crawling insects and snakes and things like that. 3 types of animal life here are mentioned. There is what McCord translated as livestock, or some translations cattle, talking about animals that could be domesticated. There are creeping things, animals that crawl or creep close to the ground. I assume that would refer to insects and lizards and possibly snakes and small quadrupeds. And then there are the beasts of the earth, or large wild animals. And God saw that it was good. But he's not finished yet with day 6. God then said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Notice what God says here. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Make, by the way, here, the word make here is asa. And notice that when God created man, that God then created man, bara, in his own image. Both words used to talk about the creation of humans. So who is the us? Let us make man. Well, that would include God, of course, Jesus, probably the Holy Spirit. They were in eternity past with the Father, and they were involved in creation. Interesting that the noun form of God is plural in Hebrew, yet the verb is singular. From what I've read, the Jews referred to God as the great singular plurality, although it does not seem they really understood this concept. But notice this emphasis on bara, created, in verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God is drawing our attention to a special distinction that man has that the rest of creation does not have. Humans are made in the image of God. In fact, humans are the only part of the creation made in God's image. So bara was needed there in the text. There's a difference between humans and animals. My professor at Freed-Hardeman, who taught Genesis, Everett Hufford Sr., pointed out that man was individually made while the animals were made in swarms. And that is a good distinction. There was something, though, about man being added to the creation that changed it from being good to being very good. Now, the closest we get to know what God's image is would be the statement of Jesus to the woman at the well in Samaria. John 4:24, God is spirit. God is spirit. He does not have a physical body as we do. Being made in his image would at least have reference to God giving humans a spiritual aspect to their being. Possibly refer to the intellect that humans have. I think would also include humans' perception of morality and their capacity to love. Notice that God made man and woman on this day. Now we're going to see more of the detail in chapter 2. Hebrew word for man is Adam. It's derived from the word for ground, Adama, and also becomes, of course, the name for the first man. God then blessed humans and gave them the instruction to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the entire creation. Again, we see that what is created is made mature, able to reproduce. God gave humans dominion over all other forms of life. The idea of dominion is to conquer and rule. But the idea in the text is that humans are God's steward of the earth. that we're placed here to take care of it. We aren't to abuse the earth, but we are to use the natural resources that God has placed there for our use. What does it mean when God blessed mankind, and earlier some of the animals? The nature of this blessing was the power to reproduce, to thrive, to prosper. The "be fruitful" phrase is really more of an explanation of the blessing rather than a command to go out and have babies. God's blessing was that we be able to have children and descendants. Notice that the man and woman were created as adults, capable of reproduction, as were the plant life and the animal life. I think we can conclude that the first man and woman would have adult minds as well, meaning that they were capable of understanding their role in creation and their relationship with God and their relationship with each other. For food, God gave the first couple the plants and the fruit of the trees. In other words, the first couple were vegetarians. If that surprises you, notice the next verse, verse 30. The animals and birds were also given the green plants for food. So they too originally were vegetarians as well. Even animals today that we think of as meat eaters can survive when needed on vegetation, on plant life. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Bill Grasham says earlier he had applied the term good to the particular items he had made. But now the sovereign creator stepped back and saw all that he had made. With enthusiasm, he pronounced all of it not simply good, but very good. The qualitative evaluation of very good was only stated by God after the creation of mankind. Adam, including male and female. Human beings stand at the pinnacle of all that God made because they alone bear the image of the Creator and are his representatives on earth. On the seventh day, the text says that God rested. Rested, as used here, is not in the sense of being exhausted and needing a day to recover. For if God is omnipotent, all-powerful, that would not be possible. He would not need a day to recover. The word simply means, and this is literally the meaning in Hebrew, that he ceased what he was doing. He was finished creating. And when God finished, he stopped. The Hebrew word that's translated rested is Shabbat. That's the verb. It only has one B. And the noun form is also Shabbat, but it has two B's. And in that, you should see the translated English word Sabbath. Bill Grasham commented, the Hebrew author was reminding the Israelite that they should emulate God by resting from their labors on the seventh day. In fact, God's resting is the rationale that's given in the Ten Commandments for Sabbath observance. Because God had finished creating, the seventh day was set apart. It was made a special day. So we see a little editorial comment by Moses here in verse 3 of chapter 2. And it's very similar to what we find in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, explaining the Sabbath day each week for Israel as being a day of rest. We can read more about that in Exodus 31, verses 14 through 17. There is no Sabbath command, though, until we get to Exodus. So it would seem that although God had everything in place for there to be a day of rest, at least it was not commanded for another 3,500 years or so. We find in Exodus 31:17 that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. On the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Although God had completed the creation, he did not stop his work. He continued, and he continues today to sustain and bless his creatures. In fact, Jesus himself said in John chapter 5, my Father works until now, and I work. Creation was finished, but God is still at work. Then we see the Toledot at the end. I like the way that McCord renders this. This is the history of the creation of the heavens and the earth. Maybe an appropriate closing comment on this section would be the first part of Psalm 136. Give thanks to Yahweh, for he is good, for his kindness is everlasting. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his kindness is everlasting. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his kindness is everlasting. To him who alone does wonderful things, for his kindness is everlasting. To him who by understanding made the heavens, for his kindness is everlasting. To him who spread out the earth on the waters, for his kindness is everlasting. To him who made great lights, for his kindness is everlasting. The sun to rule by day, for his kindness is everlasting, and the moon and the stars to rule by night, for his kindness is everlasting. And this psalm goes on to detail Israel's history. Here's a little summary of days 1 to 7. Things began being incomplete and formless. It was void. It was dark. It's interesting. That stands in contrast to what we find at the end. End of day 7, everything was complete and good, and God rested. We have these sort of 7 spheres of days 1, 2, and 3. Light, sky, from water, seas, from dry land. It's interesting. The light from darkness, the sequel to it was the sun, moon, and stars to govern the day and night. The sky from water, upper waters separate from the lower waters, and that gave a place for birds and fish to live in the sky and the waters. And then the seas coming from dry land, with the land producing vegetation. We've got then animals and humans to live on that land and to eat the plants. I think there are a few lessons we can learn from this particular section of Scripture. We see here that God is the creator of all. But think about that. This same God who has the power to dispel darkness in the physical world also has the power to dispel the darkness of sin in our lives. Again, you can read 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 4 to 6, and see more about that. And we find that the creation tells us about God and his power. Jim McGuigan wrote in his little devotional book on Genesis and Us, he said, the creation tells us of God's glory, but when God wanted to reveal himself best, he asked his son to come to us. As we saw earlier, he designed that from before the beginning. Thank you for joining us for this particular lesson. We hope that it has been useful. And if you can, join us for the next lesson in this particular series.